Hey, this is Jake Taylor, your host of the world's first interview Hikecast. We dive deep as interesting people take me on their favorite hikes. So if you're ready for something a little different, throw this on, get outside, and come take a hike with us. Today we're going for a hike with Bogumil Baranowski. Bogie is a founding partner of Sicart and Associates and previously worked at Tocqueville Asset Management. He's also the author of the book Outsmarting the Crowd. We went for a gorgeous walk around Central Park in New York City. Please enjoy this Hikecast with Bogumil Baranowski. But first, please save a spot on your shelf for my new book that's available now. It's called The Rebel Allocator, and it's a fictional coming-of-age story about a young man who learns about business and life from an unlikely teacher. Imagine Thorndike's The Outsiders meets The Karate Kid. You're probably saying to yourself, fiction? Really, Jake? My goal was to give you everything you'd learn from a good nonfiction book, but wrap it in an entertaining story. It's available now on Amazon in both print and digital formats. And now, without further delay, let's get outside.
So Jake, this is your first hike in Central Park for your podcast, right?
Yeah. I thought we would start out with, I'd like to hear a little bit about your childhood, growing up in Poland and during a much different time than what you find yourself in today.
Right.
It's always one of my favorite things actually about you is that you have that contrast in your life that you can really appreciate the differences. And I think a lot of us are blind to them because we've either grown up in a capitalist system or with a lot more freedoms that we enjoy. So tell me a little more about your childhood.
Well, it definitely wasn't Central Park in Manhattan.
I know.
So there are different parts of childhood that I remember, and since we're walking, I'm thinking about the days I spent in the woods. So growing up, we had a summer home in the 90s on a lake, and I had a ginger cocker spaniel, which is a hunting dog. We didn't hunt, but the dog loved running. So we would go, the two of us, me and the dog, for long walks in the woods. So Central Park kind of reminds me of my childhood in that sense. But I think you're curious about the earlier time, which is the 80s. So I was born at an interesting time because there was a point in history when there was a major uprising in Poland and people went to the streets. They didn't like the communist regime anymore, and millions and millions of people joined this huge movement called Solidarity, and it was a time of hope. And my parents, two medical school students in their early 20s, had a baby.
That was you?
That was me, a summer baby. It was a good time to be born because summer, your parents can spend more time with you when they're at school.
Yeah.
But soon after that, the regime was so strong that they actually made everybody get quiet again. A year later, they put in place a martial law, which is something that was done in many places at different points in time when people revolt. And what it meant, there was a travel ban, which meant that you not only couldn't leave the country, but you couldn't even leave your town, a 5 mile or 10 whatever radius. And you had to get a permit to travel to your cousins that lived in a different town. There was a curfew, you had to be home.
Yeah. What was going on at that time that they'd already changed power, but now there were other uprisings that were kind of in the works?
So since 1945, since the end of the war, 1946 exactly, the Communist Party, the party of the people, took over. And right after the war, they pretty much took away most of the property from people. So if you had too much land, they would take it away from you. Private business was not allowed unless it was really tiny, like handmade things. But all the businesses were taken over and there was no private ownership. The stock exchange was shut down in 1939 when the Nazi army invaded Poland. So there was no stock exchange, there was no business ownership in private hands, and everything was controlled and owned by the government. As you can imagine, there are huge inefficiencies of... The ideas are great, but the execution is usually very poor. So there were shortages of things, because if you tell people that they have a job for sure, you can't fire them, eventually they
don't do as good of a job.
They don't do anything. Yeah. And there's no incentive to finish anything. So the stores got a little bit more empty and more empty and more empty, and eventually people got upset at different points in time, in 1956, in 1970, and then in 1980 when I was born. So in 1980, it was probably the biggest, revolt or rebellion, whatever you want to call it, uprising around the country. It was very peaceful. People just went to the streets. But the government eventually sent out police, an army, and tanks to the streets and quiet everybody down. So 1980s were a pretty dark period because all the hope vanished. So 1980s, I think to make a point, the government wanted to tighten the screw a little bit more. So they put in ration cards. So you couldn't buy more than a certain amount, small amount of basic items like flour and sugar and chocolate. And chocolate was actually not real chocolate. People joke about it still, especially my grandparents' generation, that cocoa is actually a very expensive thing to import when the country has a shortage of dollars. So it was called a chocolate-like product.
What was it made out of? Just sugar and
like fat, some sort of fat.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, so 80s were pretty dark and a lot of people were losing hope, and the borders were shut down, and it was a very gray period. But as a kid, I thought that the whole world looks like that, right? You're born somewhere and you don't have, at the age of 5 or 6, the perspective that, the world is actually
much bigger than
much bigger, and there are all kinds of countries and political systems. So I found that all the kids go with their grandparents to a city hall and pick up a ration card to go to an empty store and figure out how to buy things. Nobody really starved because there was a big black market where you can buy eggs and meat and milk directly from the farmers. So
was that in local currency, or was that
it was
outside of?
So that was in local currency, and the price was, free market price, but I think inflated because if the whole market was producing for the whole market, I think the efficiencies in the scale would be much bigger, but it was farmers selling their surplus. I would call it free market, basically. And every town would have a street or corner, a part of town where you could go and buy things directly from farmers. So you could buy those things that were not available.
Did the government let that happen, or were they just like...
Well, it was a gray area at different points.
They just kind of looked the other way?
They looked the other way. So at different times, so probably in the 50s or 60s, the rules were even more strict. Like you couldn't, or you would go to prison for doing certain things. But in the 80s, they realized the stores are empty. People have ration cards. If they start to starve, they'll really get upset.
Yeah. So, rather than have let's let a little of the steam out of the balloon.
Exactly.
Through a black market.
But the fascinating thing is that the government needed dollars to buy things for the industry, equipment, anything. Even replacement parts for equipment that they bought earlier in the 70s. So what they would do is open a chain of stores that was called internal export, which kind of makes no sense because export means you're sending it outside.
Yeah,
but
that's a contradiction.
These were either foreign products or domestic products made just a better quality for export to the West. And you could only buy those products with dollars. Or another paper that was called a bond. And bond was a sheet of paper with a dollar amount written on it, issued by the local government, and it was the equivalent of the dollar. So you could buy those and go shop at that store because it was illegal to have dollars. But the government wanted your dollars. So it was another contradiction, right? Because they wanted your dollars to buy imported products, but you were not supposed to have dollars.
So we just created our own little piece of paper to substitute in.
But in those stores you could buy nicer products, but the prices were so out of whack because the foreign exchange was so out of whack that people were making, $20 a month. So a salary of a doctor would buy you a small box of Lego.
Wow.
It was just so out of whack and disconnected. It made no sense, but anybody that had any family outside of the country, they would send the dollars and you could go and buy. Well, for some reason, jeans Levi's were the most desirable item.
Yeah.
And anybody that had somebody that could get them dollars, having a
got
pair
jeans.
of Levi's was...
That was a sign of like doing well.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was an interesting period, and then my parents took me to Vienna when things started to open up, and the Berlin Wall either fell or was about to fall. Everything was happening so quickly at the time.
Yeah.
And we went to a supermarket, and as a kid, you go from a place where there's nothing and you don't really understand why there's nothing to a place where there's everything. And
Yeah, was it just like shocking to see?
it was shocking, and as a kid I couldn't process that. And I remember my dad would try to explain to me that it's a different economic and political system.
Yeah.
That seems to be much more successful and efficient.
Yeah, I mean, were you like, when you saw it, even at 8 or 9 years old, were you just like, well, why aren't we doing this?
That's what I thought. That's the questions that I had for my parents. But I think at that tipping point, little activity, business activity, was just starting in Poland. So those products were showing up in Poland because they were opening up the borders, opening up the economy. So I think my hope was, and I think my dad's explanation was, that any minute this will be happening in Poland.
Okay.
So I think as a kid I was very excited. It looked like, oh, this is Christmas, but this will be Christmas forever, every day.
Yeah, Christmas is coming and it's going to be every day.
That's how I felt about it. But I think what it gave me was the perspective that how the different systems work. I had so many questions, and I think it pointed me in a certain direction in terms of what I wanted to learn and study. So I loved history. I was very curious how the world looked like at different points in time. I was trying to understand why Poland ended up in this specific spot with 45 years of a very miserable communist system. And the 90s were fascinating because everything was opening up. So there were new stores opening up, new international chains opening up, and the stock exchange opened. And I was watching on the news how new companies are being listed and they're privatized. And the market went through 3 or 4 booms and busts in 10 years. As you can imagine, the market has been shut for half a century.
It's hard to find equilibrium right away, probably.
How do you, yeah, exactly.
Do you think that inspired a little bit of your interest in markets?
It did, but I think it was initially, so what I did as a kid, I had a little paper notepad, and I wrote down the names of the companies, and there were 8 or 9 at first. And I would write down their prices, and I would write imaginary share count.
Okay.
And I would track the portfolio.
Yeah, you're paper trading.
I had no idea what I was doing, but they go up and down.
Yeah.
And obviously on TV, everything was very exciting. New companies, they have growth, they're expanding. So
at that point, were you thinking that like, I would like to own these businesses, or were they more just sort of like squiggly lines?
There was more squiggly lines. There were more this imaginary idea that there's a place where things are traded, they go up and down. And then I was hearing stories of people that were making big money and then losing big money. So that was very intriguing. And I had friends whose parents had nothing to do with investments, and they were opening brokerage accounts, and then they tell us stories how much money they made.
Yeah.
So it was, as any bull market or boom period in anywhere in the world where people have stories when they have huge success. But then the internet bubble burst, and that sent a shockwave, I think, across the whole world. And that was the time when I was going to college, so all my professors immediately took this as an opportunity to explain that the stock market is a casino where people go and gamble, and you can lose everything. And then now and then there are those market wizards that just figured it out. Well, since I didn't think of myself as a market wizard, I completely ignored the stock market when I was going to school. I was learning about business, I was learning accounting, economics, I was trying to understand the world. But as you know, and I mentioned it to you a few times, that it was a day when I picked up a book One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch. And I was in Brussels at the time. I was an exchange student. And that book somehow really spoke to me. Peter Lynch was a very successful money manager, but his specialty was finding ideas in his wife's shopping cart.
Right. And it's a very relatable strategy where you just look around the things that you like, right? And then try to understand them. I think it's a gateway drug for a lot of people.
Like, I know already so much, how can I use it? And it's not that simple that this is my favorite product and I have to buy the company, and there's actually much more to it. But what Peter Lynch did for me was he opened my eyes that stocks are actually small pieces of businesses. And it's such a simple concept, but nobody told me that. And none of my professors that taught me how to price options and all kinds of things, nobody told me that the underlying asset behind that option or whatever it was, it's an actual living and breathing business that hires people to provide a service or a product, and if they're doing something right, they're actually making money. And if I could be a shareholder, no matter how small, I'm treated equally as Warren Buffett or Peter Lynch or anybody else. And those shares actually trade at $10, $20, $50. That's within reach of a lot of people, so they can all become investors and shareholders of businesses.
Right.
And I found it absolutely fascinating. Now, the other half of the story that I don't talk about too much is that the same day I was holding another book. So that's a special reveal for your podcast. And that book, you're never gonna guess what it was, but it was The Maestro, a book about Alan Greenspan.
Okay.
So I picked that one up. Alan Greenspan at the time was the rock star of, money, finance,
Central
everything.
bankers at a minimum, yeah.
Central bankers at a minimum. He was in charge of the Fed for quite a while.
I mean, they have him on as like somebody who saved the world, right?
Exactly. Well, he cut rates many, many times over. I didn't understand at the time what it really meant. But I browsed through that book, and I thought, I really don't understand what he does. So he sits there with a few other people, and they decide what the interest rates are for the entire economy. And I didn't understand it then. That was 20 years ago. I still don't understand what they really do now. So I left that book on the shelf, and I picked up Peter Lynch's book and read that one. And I think that sums up everything else in my life, that I'm still a believer in understanding the businesses.
Yeah, and the macro should stay on the shelf.
And the macro is fascinating, and it keeps me up at night sometimes. But I can't say that I believe in how things are done on that front. Very simple, going back to the little free market selling eggs in Poland in the 80s, the price is established by a mechanism of supply and demand. That many eggs, that many people. And the price is set, the eggs are sold. And it all applies to everything else, all assets and including money. That's really the essence of everything else. So how can you set the price of money and believe that few people have the knowledge and understanding how much money should cost?
Yeah.
While everything else we believe it's the market that will tell us how much can you charge for an egg. It still baffles me. Do you have a thought?
I had economics undergrad, and I remember sitting in class. We talk about like minimum wage and how that would basically eliminate jobs for anyone whose marginal product was below the minimum wage.
Right.
And cause more unemployment than otherwise would be what would be clear through the market. Okay. And there's social arguments to be made against it, and it's not always like just pure clean cut economics, but then I would go an hour later down the hall and I would sit in a macroeconomics class, and they would talk about interest rates and stimulating the economy and all these different things.
Right.
And I would think, well, you just told me an hour ago that no matter anything that you do to nudge the price of something will have some impact on someone. You can't always tell where it's going to show up, but like it's going to be probably suboptimal. Mm-hmm. And then you're telling me that you set the most important price in all the world, and you know what you're doing, and there's not going to be any consequences, and that you can somehow control this machine And I just remember thinking, like, this is ridiculous.
It makes no sense. It didn't make sense when I was holding those two books that represented the two worlds that you're talking about, and it still doesn't make any sense. I think there's no government official that can successfully decide what the price of a pair of sneakers should be, and even more so, there's no government official that can successfully decide what the price of money for everybody participating in the economy, all the way from student loans, credit cards, business loans, bonds, equities, everything else that's priced according to the price of money. How much does it cost for me to have your money for a day, 3 months,
and
30 years?
I think that people forget or maybe never learn that the interest rates are also what set the temporal supply and demand. Like,
yes.
How much do we want now versus how much do we want later? And to monkey around with that, you end up, I think, doing some pretty perverse things to the economy. Very hard to measure where the problems are, but
that's the accepted way of doing things.
Yeah.
And that's something that you and I talk about a lot. So I think we both have a certain idea of the way the world should work, in the sense that there could be more benefit from just more efficiency, more freedom, and then the way the world is, which is what we just have to accept, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I was born in the 80s, and the world I was living in doesn't exist anymore, right? There's no centrally planned, controlled economy in Poland. The stores are full, and there are all kinds of jobs. There's complete freedom. Obviously, it's a huge leap from where the country was in the 80s. And I was looking at some numbers and statistics. So the number of registered cars in 1989, when I was 9 years old, was 300,000 in all of Poland, a country of 40 million people. And now, it's still about 40 million people. But guess how many cars there
are? 10 million.
33.
33 million?
Yeah.
Wow.
So
that's a pretty big difference.
Yes. Yeah, it's 30-some million cars. So that's one way of looking at it. The second way of looking at it, a median salary affords you to buy 10 or 20 times as much in food products, so eggs or meat. So that's a huge leap in
quality of life.
Quality of life, right? So that was the world that was, and it was a better idea how to organize things, and it was clearly successful. So, you and I are still in our 30s, and I'm thinking the next 10, 20, 30 years, I can imagine that certain ways that we take as permanent today, monetary policy being one, can change and evolve into something different and hopefully better. So I'm always very optimistic that things will continue. We, as humanity, we make mistakes over and over again.
Sure.
Well, the other interesting statistic that I saw that I shared with you the other day was that, we think of Roman Empire 2,000 years ago as this hugely successful, took up the entire European Union of today, even more, North Africa.
Yeah.
But the GDP and purchasing power of the whole empire was lower, slightly lower than the poorest country in the whole world today. So it's a huge leap that we've made as a civilization from where we were even during the Roman times. And obviously there was a small group that had everything in Rome, right?
Yeah.
And there was a small group that could read and had access to everything and had a wonderful life. But when you compare it with today, pretty much everybody can read in the developed world. Everybody has huge access to books and information. I was reading how Marcus Aurelius' Meditation, there was a copy or two held by some monk until the 1100s, and then finally somebody translated it and it started spreading.
Yeah.
But think about it,
Now it's free.
Now it's
free.
You
can get a PDF anywhere you want.
Anywhere you want, and you can read it. And I think we made a huge progress over the last 2,000 years. We made a huge progress over the last 30 years. Look at China, look at Europe. There are huge leaps in productivity and the level of people's lifestyle. So I'm very hopeful about the future. And if that's the case, there will be huge investment opportunities for us by wonderful businesses, probably in industries that we can't even imagine. I like talking to people that started in this business in the 60s or 70s. And I asked them like what kind of industries there were and what did you buy. And the exciting part was the computer power leasing companies like IBM. And, but everything else was as old as the industry itself. Steel and coal and chemicals. And,
Railroads.
Right, but look at the world now. So U.S. Steel is a few billion-dollar company. It actually was a billion-dollar company until not long ago, which is about the price that Carnegie sold it for.
In what was it? When did he sell it?
About 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So I thought about it. Oh, wow. I'm sure that the company has changed. They had some spin-offs. But all in all, from $1 billion to $1 billion in 100 years. While at the same time, Carnegie's biggest donation that went to a trust, Carnegie Corporation, which was about $100 million. Over 100 years, it grew to $3 billion with 100 years of giving it away, which is fascinating. Was it all invested in U.S. Steel? No, it was invested in all kinds of businesses that have been successful ever since. So the beauty of free market economy and capitalism is that there will be new ideas, new businesses, new jobs, new skills needed. And the exciting and the scary part is that the change is so much faster than ever before.
Yeah, you could describe value investing as a bet on reversion to the mean, and that the world is actually not changing as fast as everyone thinks it is. This company's going to bounce back, let's say. But what if the pace of change actually does accelerate to the point where maybe value as a kind of a philosophy of betting implicitly on the reversion to the mean doesn't make sense anymore? What do you think about that?
Well, it's a fair argument. I think the whole concept of value investing has evolved and changed. So in my day job, I manage family fortunes, and the goal is to manage them over generations, right? So I know immediately that I can't put it in a U.S. Steel kind of company and just forget about it. There are actually very few businesses that were not exposed to too much change, and there are very few industries that actually were able to produce profits consistently through all the change. And it's certain good brands and confectionery alcohol and a few other things held up very well. But when you think about a family fortune and investing over 100 years, you have to believe that there will be opportunities. And then how do you find those opportunities? I still believe that buying anything at a discount to its price, so using value as your measure instead of what's popular, which is actually one of the rules that Buffett put in his initial partnership. He said that the investments will not be based on popularity, but on value. And I think that rule still applies. What it means to different people, like you and I, if we looked at each other's stocks, I think we might disagree on a lot of fronts. But the concept and the rule or the principle or the belief is the same. I would never buy anything that's an all-time high just because somebody just upgraded it, right? What I would like to see is, I call it down cheap out of favor. So I'm looking for stocks that are already down, that are cheap on, and you can look at it in different ways, but basically cheaper than they've been in a while, and out of favor because that means that no high expectations are priced in. Now that gives me a very wide range of companies that can be small, can be big. I want good management, good business, and some promising prospects, because buying a company that's shrinking, it's a very difficult investment to make. So then there are three things that I try to avoid. And usually those things, funny enough, happen at the same time. So one is too much leverage, two, it's questionable management, and then a secular decline. When you think about it, my biggest fear is permanent loss of capital. That's my real risk. That can happen at the same time. You might have a questionable management that's running a business that's clearly in a secular decline, or they don't believe in it, and they use leverage to hide it by acquiring businesses or paying a higher dividend than they can afford.
How do you tease out
cyclicality
versus secular decline?
I know. So you and I are talking now in April of 2019, which is probably the 11th year or the 10th year of the longest bull market in history. And a lot of people think that there is no such thing as a cycle. And
we've reached a permanent high plateau.
Exactly, right? So you're asking a fair question, and I have a problem with it, because there are a lot of companies that I know very well, and I know that they're cyclical. And I can think of a few transportation companies. The thing is that they reached new highs for their margins, new highs for their revenues.
Yeah.
And there's no sign of weakness. If anything, there was a slight sign of weakness now with the trade war and certain impact on the volumes. Everybody panicked, and those stocks are actually down already quite a bit, 20-30%. But now when I look at their fundamentals, I'm thinking we're not only above average,
Yeah.
we're very close to the peak. And as exciting as it is that the stocks are down, it's a long way down to anywhere closer. I'm not even talking about retesting the lows for margins or volumes, but getting anywhere closer.
I saw some research recently that said that if we had margins mean revert to long run average, and we had valuations mean revert to long run average, that's like down 60% from here.
I know, which is pretty scary.
It's a little scary.
A little scary. Today it's one of probably the most interesting times in our careers, looking back and looking forward. I think it's a trying time, because you and I know that with the market rising, people like us, I would call us, cautiously optimistic, but with emphasis on caution.
Yeah. Say long run optimistic.
Long run optimistic.
But short run
concerned
about valuations.
Exactly. We can't really shine in this market. So just to give listeners some background, but until, let's say, April last year, all the stocks were close to all-time highs. It was new peaks for the market. And really, since April, we had few dips, especially in December of 2018. Right? But until April, let's say, of last year, the only way to outperform the market was to buy more of the things that are going up. A true momentum investor market.
Yeah.
If your goal is just to outperform the market no matter what risk, right? So when people ask me, how do you outperform this market? I say, well, you double the exposure to the very top
lever
stocks.
beta.
The fascinating thing about that market was that a larger and larger percent of the performance was attributed to a small group of companies.
Yes.
10 or so companies that had a quarter of the performance of the market to half to pretty much 100% of the, right? So what that means that if you exclude those 10 companies or 15, the rest of the market hasn't really done anything.
Right.
And actually is down, and a lot of them are in serious correction territory. So how do you outperform that market? You can obviously shop among the wounded soldiers that still have a lot to give up.
Questionable where they,
right?
How wounded are they?
But the easiest way to outperform that market, at least in that short window, was to buy high-flying stocks. And that's it. But that's not the way I think about investing. That's not the way you think about investing. And when you have your own money or you're managing a family fortune, that's not how you think about investing. The other point is that I don't even think about the benchmark as a good gauge. Because the benchmark, what is a benchmark? Benchmark is a collection of companies, 30 or 500 or 2,000 or whatever it is. And those companies can perform in all kinds of ways. And stocks go up for two reasons. One is earnings go up, and second, the valuations go up, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have a period when the valuations expand, the performance, in my mind, is not deserved unless it's a recovery from a depressed valuation. But if it's a pricey market that becomes more pricey, becomes extremely pricey, the last two legs of it, which could be 30-50% performance, are not deserved, because eventually investors realize, wow, this company cannot grow at 50% forever. And we see it more and more. There are a few companies that I watch out of curiosity that had a 50% growth rate, and the growth rate slowed down to 40, 45, and those stocks are down 50% in a matter of days. So that's a huge loss in market value.
Yeah.
And it's still a fast-growing company, right? 45%. So it might be a hugely successful business, but a very poor investment. It reminds me of what Bezos said about internet bubble when Amazon stock, something that people forgot, went from 100 and change to $6 or $7. And he said that he started his shareholder letter with one word: ouch. And he said, well, what I did was look at the business. And he says, volumes are going up, there's demand, trends are very good, but that doesn't matter because there was such a huge disconnect between the price and the value being the earning power of the business, that to close that gap, you needed a 95% decline in the price, which is a scary thought. And I think it taught him a lesson. And when the market was pushing Amazon to $2,000 a share and $1 trillion valuation, that's with a T.
Yeah.
And one of the first with Apple.
Capital T.
Capital T, yes. He said humbly that I remember the days
Yeah.
when the stock went from 100 to 6. So what market gives, the market takes sometimes. So
when they look at, let's say that you look at your 401k balance, 30% of that money in there is probably not yours. That's the government's. Right. So you already need to discount that. And then over and above, if we're in an expensive territory, what you have in there is probably not worth what it says, right, if you actually needed it. Or if we're in a cheap market, what you have in there is worth more than what it says.
Right.
So you need to kind of make your own little bit of adjustments to whatever your account statement says to get to a closer, true sort of economic real value. But we're in one of those times now where every account statement should probably be taken with a pretty healthy dose of grain of salt, right?
What about your home value?
Same thing.
Same thing, right? So that goes back to what we talked about earlier. When you hold interest rates at very low levels, you have to eventually inflate the assets, right? Because there are more and more buyers that use borrowed money to buy homes, businesses, and even share buybacks by companies are done with borrowed money, which is absolutely insane.
Yeah, what do you think is that going to continue into 2019, 2020? I mean, we had I think it was close to $1 trillion of buybacks in 2018.
It was incredible. So that's a conversation I had the other day with one of my partners. We were talking about the tax reform, because just to give people background, we had a tax reform well over a year ago, but it's really making an impact last year, this year. For people, individuals, it's a give or take depending on if you're in a high or low tax rate state. But for corporations, it was probably the biggest tax cut in a while, or at least in recent history. The thinking was that companies will take that money and invest in the business. Basically, this will lead to a higher capex. But the truth is that capex takes time to deliver results, right? You plant a tree and you come back the next day and you say, where's the apple?
Yeah.
Well, it's not there. But what gives you the immediate result is a share buyback. So they use that $1 trillion not to expand, grow, get new equipment, become more productive, create more jobs, or even put it in R&D and develop something new. What they did was buy back shares, because you immediately can show in a quarter or two that you have earnings growth instead of 2%, 7%, right?
Right, EPS,
earnings per share. And that's what everybody is watching. So I think that the whole world has become so short-term focused. We want to see immediate results, and that's the only way to get them.
And that goes back to what I was saying about the temporal coordination of interest rates.
Right.
They pull everything into the immediate future when you have super low rates.
And you can do it how many times?
I don't know. Do you want to go to negative 10%? I don't know.
I don't know.
Is that more?
But there is a point where you can't pull anymore. And the interesting thing that you mentioned earlier was with borrowed money. The way we establish prices, it's a fascinating mechanism, right? Supply and demand. And the demand part can be manipulated if you make money too available too cheaply to too many people.
Credit on top of money.
Exactly, yeah, credit. But it's seen the same way. If I walk into a dealership and I say I want that car, and I bring $30,000 that I saved, that was earned, taxed, and saved, and the next guy comes in and gets the same car with a $200 lease
with a
payment.
Signature.
With a signature, with a $200 lease payment, that's basically a loan that somebody has to
create.
Finance. Yeah. And we are equal demand. Like he's 1 unit, I'm 1 unit of demand, right?
Yeah.
But it's not equal because I actually had that money. He borrowed it from the future, hopefully, he'll pay it off. He will actually pay it off. I don't think a lot of the other participants will pay off their loans. And the biggest of all of them is the government debt, right? But it's a whole different story how that will work. I think.
Does it? I mean, right now, MMT is popular. Well, I would say popular, but it's sort of caught a little bit of buzz recently. Which is the idea that borrowing from the government doesn't matter.
Right.
And we can just keep borrowing and there's no consequences. And I view it as almost like overclocking the system. Like you have a computer that you could turn it up and maybe fry it out, but you can like overclock it for a period of time.
Right.
Is that, what do you think, how does that fit into this?
Well, it's fascinating because I feel like when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I had an accelerated course in history, economics, and politics in one. And one of the fascinating things that was happening in the 90s, early 90s, was Poland wanted to rejoin the world in terms of trade, currency, banking, because it was completely disconnected for 45 years, living in this...
Yeah, it's just an island, really.
Complete island. And one of the rules that the IMF put in was you have to get your debt under control. You can't run deficits the way you were.
Yeah.
And the biggest part, you can't print money
Okay.
to pay for those deficits.
Right.
So what are we doing right now, which is 30 years later? We're living in a world, not just the US, but also Europe and Japan.
Yeah.
And apparently 20 of the major central banks in the world.
China.
Let me
Pretty big too.
real quick. And what we're doing is we're printing money to pay for the deficits. Because what's a deficit? Deficit is what we're spending much more than we're collecting in taxes, right?
Right.
Which is a place where all the democracies, and not only democracies that in the world, but especially democracies end up, because people don't want to be taxed and people want to get stuff, right?
That's a very human thing, yeah.
How do you get elected? You have to promise a lot and you'll say you'll cut taxes, which is pretty much where we end up with $1 trillion, with a T again,
Deficit.
deficits in the US right now.
That's the part that I don't understand when I hear people say, like, man, the economy is booming.
Right.
And then I say, well, what about we're borrowing $1 trillion basically from the future right now?
Right.
How does that factor in? Like, that's probably a good, like 10%-ish of maybe of US GDP. Is that, I mean, somewhere in that neighborhood?
No, that's fair. I think it's very hard
and it's that marginal 10% extra,
Yes.
right?
That spikes up the prices of the car, of the house, and of
Assets.
of all kinds, including shares of companies. I think it's very hard to grasp it as a macro whole country. But if you think of it as a household, right? Let's say it's a household that brings in $100,000 and spends whatever it is now,
110%.
right?
Yeah.
So, and you say, oh, it's a huge success. Look, they get off.
Look at how well they're living.
But the intuition tells us that there's something wrong and it doesn't add up. You can only go that far because eventually that deficit will accumulate and has accumulated to the point that we have 20 trillion out of 20 trillion economy. So 100%. So it's a point where that household has 100,000 in debt. When the cost of that debt becomes an issue. Now, if you keep the rates at zero, you can play this game for a long time, right? It's as if you figured out a way to cheat the system. The household has a problem because the household doesn't control the money. The government, for a while, doesn't have that problem because they can print money. So US is in a hugely favorable position. Fair, unfair, I don't know. But
Well, I mean, it probably goes back to military power. Like, who's going to say no?
right?
Right? I mean, at the end of the day, if you have a big stick, you get to tell people a lot of
You set the
things.
rules.
Yeah.
But they borrow in dollars, they spend in dollars, and they can print those dollars. So what Poland was not allowed to do by the IMF said, if you want to join the party, you have to play by the rules. It's
Yeah.
like the guy that joins you at the game of Monopoly, and you have to tell him, the rules are,
You don't get to be the bank.
you don't get to be the bank. And that's what IMF told Poland, and Poland said, okay, and they stopped printing money. And now the Fed was able to pump in 5 trillion into this 20 trillion economy. And we just saw little signs of maybe more normalized trends with rates going up, money getting pricier, and the Fed even started to shrink that balance sheet, right?
Right.
And since, again, we were talking in April of 2019, in December, we had a dip in the market and the Fed decided to stop raising rates. And at the same time, they promised not to shrink the balance sheet anymore.
Right. We're done with our quantitative tightening.
So what it tells me is the things and the tools that you were learning in your class, and then I was learning at some point too, that are supposed to help in times of true distress, where the government steps in and spends more, right? Traditional Keynes.
Right.
And also provides cheaper money, pretty much make the blow a little bit less painful, right?
Yeah.
Because that's all it does. All those tools that should be saved for a recession, maybe a depression, maybe a real shock, we're using them now when we have a slight dip in the stock market, which leaves them with fewer options in the future. I think it's fascinating to watch how they think and how they react. I read quite a few books that you and I talked about. One of them is Nami Prince's Collusion, and how the bankers used to be independent, not just from their governments, but from each other. So there were some discrepancies in the way they would have their local policies. But these days, it looks like all of them
Coordinated
are on the same page, which is more money, easier money, and let's keep it going. But as you said, it's not that real. It's borrowed money. It's the household that's living on much more than they can actually earn.
I've kind of always thought that Keynes got a bad rap in a way, or that when we go like a full cycle here, we'll be able to say that he gets a bad rap in that he did say, like, turn the spigot on in down times, but he also wanted surpluses during the good times.
Which people forgot about.
We never do that part, right?
Yes.
Another interesting thing I've thought about is kind of a thought experiment, and this is like going to be a very probably politically contentious thing to say, but it's just sort of fun. Imagine a thought experiment where you go back and assassinate Keynes before any of his ideas can spread.
Right.
Does that actually save like millions of lives because we couldn't finance so many wars?
Wow, that's a big assumption.
I think that someone else would have come out with something similar. So you're probably not really saving the problem. You're not actually solving the problem, but it is kind of an interesting thought experiment. The monetary policy, the academic underpinning for a particular monetary policy has led to an ability of governments to finance a lot of shenanigans.
Right. So let's take it to the next level and think about what actually allowed the governments in the whole world to run long-term fiscal deficits. And the truth is that it all started with the end of the relative gold standard, right? Yeah. I don't want to say real, but as real as it gets at the time in 1930s, during the Great Depression, the US went off the gold standard, raised the price of gold, and made ownership of gold illegal, which is, in my mind, one of the biggest violations of property rights.
Very surprising, isn't it?
Right? So, because if I'm not allowed to own an asset that protects my wealth, you may as well come and confiscate everything I have, right?
You're letting your biases show right now.
But from that point on, we could run humongous deficits all around the world because we would print money, we would fool people into accepting paper money that's as good as gold.
Even like post-Bretton Woods?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
It continued, and then it got stretched to the point that Nixon completely
suspended it.
Yeah, and so let's see where this price is. And it priced much higher than the government believed. Now, let's assume for a minute that Keynes was never born. Gold standard stayed in place.
Okay.
Right? In 1930s. The Great Depression would have been probably longer, more painful. And it was
Is that true though? I don't know. Like you look at like the 1920-21 Depression.
Right.
And they allowed wages to drop a lot, markets cleared, and it was over within, I don't know, 18 months or something.
Would it be a deeper cut?
Yes, it was painful, but
Yeah.
you took your medicine,
Right.
and you moved on.
You accept the pain. I think the recovery would have been more natural, organic, not borrowed. And obviously World War II happened, so it's a chicken and egg. Would the war happen had gold standard been in place and all that, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. And the truth is that the nation can only take that much pain. And if they're taking too much pain, they can be swayed in all kinds of directions. And unfortunately for Europe, but the pain that Germany was experiencing at the time swayed the country in a whole different direction, right?
Right.
Would Germany be able to finance a war in a true gold standard world without deficits? I don't know. Would the US be able to fight in the war without humongous deficits in the 40s? I don't know, right?
Yeah, well, and
'Cause
even
it's all-
what about now, though, I think that the argument could be made that if we all had to cut checks
Yeah.
to go send troops to Iraq, let's say,
It would be a very different story.
would we support that? I'm not.
Not
I
so
kind of
sure.
have a hard time believing that.
Well, it's fascinating what you say, because you connected the deficits and monetary policy with where the money gets spent, right?
Yeah.
So when you look at the U.S. budget, a disproportionate amount goes to the military. And it's a whole separate discussion. But we spoke about the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire had currency made of, well, silver, gold at different points, but it was solidus, one currency used by the Romans to pay soldiers. Hence the word soldier in many languages comes from the word solidus, and the word solid meaning
Like pure coin, not
yes, not fake, not fraud,
not
it's real,
diluted.
not diluted, real gold. Why? Because the soldier risked his life to go to war for the emperor, and the last thing he wanted is to have his family cheated out of his honest pay, right?
Yeah.
So the minute later on the Byzantine Empire messed with the currency to the point that it was worth 2% of the original value, Venice, their biggest trade partner, said no thank you. We're going to start minting our own gold currency, right? Which is another lesson in international trade. How long can your trade partners accept paper money? Because you can make your own people accept paper money because they have no choice, right?
Right.
But your trade partners eventually can say,
Enough's
I
enough.
don't want it.
I don't want your paper.
I don't want it. But back to your point, imagine that all the wars were fought with honest money that the country had to earn by taxing and overtaxing its citizens.
And an opportunity cost of what
else can you do
I'm
with
not
that
going to get a car at home
Yeah.
because my resources are being diverted to a tank to send somewhere else.
Yeah, and you paint on the tanks or new tanks and all that. It's all very pricey. Is it necessary to keep peace around the world? The other idea is that we're living as the globe, as the 7 billion of us, in the most peaceful times in history, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, there are some local conflicts. Some of them are horrible.
But not much relative
But
to
not
human
much
history.
to the extent of so many people getting killed in conflicts.
Especially per capita.
Exactly. So that's an accomplishment. So it's again the chicken and egg. Can you have that kind of peace without the intimidation power of those tanks and their fresh paint? And without that peace, can you have the trade and the business success of international companies that feel safe investing at the other end of the world, holding their properties there and doing business? So it's that silent, we take it for granted that it exists, and you don't have to worry that somebody will go out and take your stuff away. Why would any company open any manufacturing plant or any presence anywhere else if they didn't know for sure that this is, there's peace over there, there's a peaceful route from over there to my end market, and everything connected, right? It's like,
So there are dividends that I think a lot of our businesses enjoy from having a stout military.
Right.
And we then also enjoy them in probably relatively lower prices. If
that's true.
If ExxonMobil had to go and have their own security detail, protect all their assets,
how would it look
that
like?
would cost more for us.
Right, but then there's a question like who, you talked about the check. You, as a person, write a check to pay for an effort in somewhere in the Middle East, let's say, right?
Yeah.
and it comes down to $12,000 for your household. What do you do? It's a very different vote than saying, oh yes, I'm in favor. You actually have to pay for it.
Yeah.
It's a tricky proposition. I think we don't really feel the cost because it's all lumped into one.
Yeah.
And we all pay, we all get something out of it. But if it was a very individual vote and choice, which, it takes me to a whole different point, which is, technology today, democracy today, and communication today. When you think about it, we have the computing power to go and ask people.
Direct democracy.
Yeah. Getting closer to a direct democracy where we can ask people, do you want something?
Yeah.
Which cuts both
if
ways.
Yes, okay, debit your card.
Yeah, pay for it.
Yeah.
And I think it would be a very empowering feeling that I made a difference, I voted, I helped this guy get a house and start a life somewhere, if it's a welfare program.
I fixed this pothole in my neighborhood.
I fixed this pothole.
By clicking yes on my...
Now, the other point is the way you ask the question. If you lump too many things into one question and you make it a Brexit vote, yes or no, which is something that's impossible to digest by an average human, even by an expert in one specific field, right?
Yeah, no, it's such a such a web of entanglement.
Exactly, they still can't figure out in 2019 April.
What does this actually mean for me?
Right, what it means for me. So you have to ask questions that I can actually relate to, I can understand. There's a pothole in my neighborhood. It costs $2,000 to fix it. Everybody in the zip code or in the area gets an email and gets to vote, or we're going to pay for it. But that would be a very cool way of gauging what people actually want.
Yeah, there's definitely a disintermediation right now in all of that, where we don't really get to vote. I mean, we vote the people who then get to make the vote.
Right, a republic.
Yeah.
They represent us. But given that we have more and more technology that allows us all, you can ask
to intermediate.
Exactly. I was reading about Facebook, how many users they have. It's over 1 billion of daily users and all that. But basically, you could ask people about all those little things and have them decide. And going back to the earlier conversation, I'm very optimistic that eventually we'll figure out even better ways of managing our lives, managing our countries, managing our economies.
Yeah.
And there will be more power in people's hands than ever before.
We need a state to try it as a test case.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the things I think that makes the U.S. a very interesting organism, is that you have these different subsections inside of it that can try out little things and be these laboratories. And then you get an emergent process of,
hey,
this works. Everybody, let's try doing this more. But I feel like too strong of a federal government tamps down on that laboratory.
That's true.
And I feel like we've maybe swung a little bit too far into the
federal
central power.
They can decide for all of us.
A little bit too much of that, probably.
But speaking of states, you already experience different tax rates in different states, right? And we're talking not just about income tax, but capital gains, estate, property taxes. They all add up.
Sales
taxes. But when you think about it, it's an opportunity to vote with your feet, which is something that one of my libertarian professors at some point, Peter Bedke, who might be listening, told me,
Peter.
Vote with your feet. Peter, I voted. And my vote was to come to New York City, to here, Manhattan. But the same vote happens when people move to Tennessee or Florida. It's the same idea that they choose a state that offers more. And that kind of freedom goes back to the individual. You don't feel like paying 10, 12%. You have a choice, which is beautiful. And I think the future will show that there will be more that the states have to offer and incentivize. And it's also happening in Europe. See, Europe is a fascinating experiment with the European Union and a lot of centrally planned and decided things on so many levels. Some of them are good, some of them clearly upset people given the Brexit outcome. But the countries compete for people. And for example, Netherlands has a program now that gives you a big tax incentive if you're a high-skilled tech
engineer or something. Yeah.
So look at that. So they're not telling you, come here because here we'll take 80% of your money and give you a very nice parking for your bike. They say, no, will let you keep more of your money so you can do with it whatever you want.
Yeah.
Now, Portugal, another country that's offering a program that also is geared to high-skilled labor, but also retirees that are living in high-tax countries where they now, after working all their life, they have to pay taxes on their pension. So it's a double whammy. And Portugal says, if you come here, you have sun, nice climate, good food, lower cost of living, and lower taxes. So countries start to compete and upset the other countries in the process, but
Yeah.
they start to compete in that sense, like offering more.
Where citizens start to win.
Vote with your feet.
So when are you going to move from New York then?
What's that?
So when are you going to move from New York then?
Well, you know that I voted again with my feet, and I lived in the city for 15 years, and Central Park is my backyard. And only a few months ago, I moved out of state, across the water, where I get more for less, and I don't pay city tax, which all adds up when you think about it. So the city tax is about 4%, and people say, try to save 5 or 10% of your income. When you think about, I get 4% right there. Yeah. That's a nice little treat. But I think that, the overarching idea for what you and I are trying to do is convince people to live below their means, save, and invest. And if you're doing it on your own, and I have a lot of doubts and questions about what the government has promised and what it can offer, especially to younger people. And I feel that the younger generation, including us, we start to have doubts and we start to question the ability of those institutions to provide. Which brings it back to the individual, right? We keep on coming back to the individual, that the individual has the choice and has to save and become self-reliant in a way. And you have to do it because not only, the part that, in 40 years I can retire, but the whole idea to have the money now. So if you can live below your means today and save a large portion of your income, have a lower cost of living within your abilities, and invest it so that in 5-10 years you have 5 or 10 or 15 years of your living expenses saved. And it gives you such a
freedom, really.
Complete freedom, right? So when the next job shows up and you don't want to take it, you can say, I really don't have to because I have 10 years of living expenses saved. It gives you huge flexibility. So many people are in jobs that they hate and they keep them only to live above their means, to buy stuff they don't want, to impress people that they don't like. And it's not my words, somebody else said it, so credit to you, whoever you are. And I think it's so powerful because we're all caught up in this world where we're trying to impress and show, and eventually, we live lives that are not happy, fulfilling, or satisfying, and definitely very stressful. Why do it to yourself? Like, you have the power to make that difference. So
I think that's a beautiful place to wrap up. Anything else that you wanted to share?
Well, one big thing is that I just finished a very advanced draft of my second book. The title is still undecided, but the essence of the book, it talks about investing, it talks about life, and it talks about family, because I work mostly with family fortunes and multiple generations. But the one thing, when I wanted to condense the essence of the book, like if I had only a few minutes of your time and one page,
How could I do it?
How could I do it? And I have the 3 rules that you and I talked about. One is save as much as you can.
Yeah.
And I said 50% of your income, which is, I know, ambitious and extreme. But what brought it home for me was that if you save 50% of your income, it means that 1 year of work buys you 1 year of vacation or retirement. If you're investing on your own, go the passive way, although I believe in stock picking. The 60-40% stocks and bond portfolio is something that has worked very well through ups and downs, especially if you can spread it over time.
Right.
And the last thing that people ask me, that's a very powerful question, how much money do I need to retire? And the fascinating thing is that even people in our profession ask me that, so how much do I need to retire?
Right.
And I ask them, how much do you spend a year? And as a rule of thumb, multiply it by 25, which is the opposite of a 4% rule, that you don't spend more than 4% of what you have.
And I found also that you probably need to multiply what they tell you by about 25 to 50%
more.
Because they spend more than they realize.
Think about it. If you were in a position right now, or in 5 or 10 years, that you have already 25 years of your living expenses saved, even if it's not enough to live until 90 and not doing anything, it's a
Big start.
big.
Start, yeah.
Even if you have 5 or 10 years, that's a huge step. If you have 25, it's a wonderful place. If you want to use the 3% rule, make it 33 times as much, and you're going to be in a wonderful place to have all the choices and the freedom and a happy life without stress.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up.
All right.
Thanks for coming on a little beautiful walk through Central Park and
Thank you for having me.
sharing your thoughts and your history. It's great.
Hope you enjoyed today's Hikecast. If you'd like to take me on your favorite hike, email me at 5goodquestions@gmail.com, all spelled out. Lastly, pick up your copy of The Rebel Allocator, available on Amazon in both print and digital formats, and soon to be Audible. See you on the trail soon.